This is one of a series of webinars that we will be hosting with our grantees as they complete their projects. This is our 4th project webinar, and you can expect several more to come in 2019 as more projects will be completed. Today's presentation is from Mark Southerland, Vice President with AKRF Incorporated, which is an environmental planning and engineering consulting firm. This grant was for a 1-year research project that looked into whether watershed health is better in protected versus unprotected watersheds. Mark and his team examined this topic looking at 20 years of data on stream health collected across all types of habitats, land uses, and protection statuses for the state of Maryland. I think you'll find the results pretty interesting. Before we get started, I want to thank the EPA Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, as well as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, for their support for the Healthy Watersheds program. Projects like the one you're going to hear about today are possible because of that support, and we sincerely value their partnership. I also want to remind everyone that we do have another grant cycle planned for 2019. The request for proposals and application form are available on the U.S. Endowment's website under the section on RFPs. Proposals are due February 4th, 2019. If you have ideas for projects, we are happy to discuss them with you. Please contact me or Peter Stengel with the U.S. Endowment. Our contact information is on the RFP form itself. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Mark, welcome. Thanks for your work, and the mic is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Camille. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone about Healthy Watersheds. Again, thank you to the Healthy Watersheds Consortium for providing the grant under the research and tools component of their program. And it was an interesting project, and hopefully some people will find this informative, and I look forward to your questions at the end. So the first thing, of course, I want to do is to thank my collaborators. Here on the first slide, Carlos Lozano did the statistical work, and Andrea Fortman did the GIS work for this project. And also, it wouldn't have been possible without the data from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Maryland Department of the Environment. So if this works, I will switch to the next slide. If everyone can see that and hear me. The outline of what I'm going to cover in the next 30 minutes or so is the research question that was posed, the methods that we used to address it, the results we got, and our final conclusions at the end. So the research question in 2 forms. The general question is, what is the effect of healthy watershed actions on stream condition? And more specifically, we're looking at the streams in Maryland. And so we're looking at the protected versus non-protected areas of the state. And we have a data set that covers 20 years from 1995 to 2016. So it's really the confluence of that amount of data and the time period that allowed us to ask this question, which I think has been of interest to lots of folks over the years. And so again, we were very fortunate to have a lot of stream data for the Maryland Biological Stream Survey, but to also have a lot of GIS data from Maryland IMAP and the Chesapeake Bay program on protected lands. And then we used statistical analysis. We used 2 different models for each step of the way so that we can compare those and see how consistent the results were. So I know there's folks from all over the country here, and so I just want to give you a little brief introduction to what the Maryland Biological Stream Survey is. Been involved since its inception in 1993, and it's now sampled more than 5,000 stream sites over 20 years. Collects a lot of data, but what we're interested today is really focusing on the primary indicators of stream condition, and this is the fish and benthic invertebrate indices of biotic integrity, the IBIs. These are reference-based indicators where you look at good streams without human impact, determine what kinds and numbers of species or taxa exist, and by comparing to those references, you can determine whether the stream that you're sampling now is good, fair, poor, very poor on a scale of 1 to 5. We use the number 3 as the threshold where our streams above are healthy and those below are not. And again, as I mentioned, we have two different kinds of indicators, so all across the state, and this map is just to illustrate that there's wide coverage. As I said, 5,000 some sites over the years, both random and targeted sites have been collecting fish and benthic invertebrates. Anyone not familiar with benthic invertebrates, it's basically the insects and crustaceans that in their larval form or in some adult forms live pretty much at the bottom of the stream. Having these two different indicators gives us different pictures of the health of the stream. Fish move around, as you know. Benthic macroinvertebrates generally stay put and therefore are more consistently affected by various stresses like pollution, but again, a little bit different picture from both. So that's having that data set of biological indicators so that we can speak to stream condition throughout the entire state is very important, and over the time that we're looking at it, and then also knowing what the status of the lands are where these streams were sampled. So again, we're fortunate to have a robust data set in Maryland where we've indicated, as you can see in this map, various different kinds of protected lands. There's a series of there, and really this map is just to show you that they cover the entire state. So most of the colors appear throughout the state, which is good for this kind of analysis. And protected lands vary in types. So here's the types that we have in our data set. Protected lands related to the Coastal Estuarine Land Conservation Program, which focus again on shorelines and those kinds of habitats. DNR-owned properties and conservation easements, which is a variety of different things. Forest Conservation Act easements. This is the state where you have a Forest Conservation Act that affects and limits the amount of forest removal with development throughout the state. And the easements can be of varying sizes and varying qualities. Protected federal lands, local protected lands, which again are highly diverse, private conservation lands, Maryland Environmental Trust easements, Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation easements, rural legacy properties, all have different objectives in their programs but are preserving land in one way or another. And lastly, transfer development and purchase development rights, which is specifically changing development intensity from one place to another, and again, may not have specific ecological attributes associated with it. So because they're so diverse, the different land protection types, we wanted to look at them in different categories. And so when you see the analysis that I'm going to describe next, you'll see that we looked at protected lands in these different categories. All protected lands, no matter what, that whole list that I just showed you. DNR-owned lands and easements, because DNR, of course, has the mandate to manage the natural resources of the state. Protected lands that are 100 acres minimum, so the larger ones, and ones that are large, 100-acre minimum, and also all DNR lands. So working our way down through what we think are the more protective types of protected lands. So here's the DNR lands. Again, I mentioned that as being the most protective, one of the most protective types, but again, it's a variety of different things, so it's not, again, just one thing. State parks, natural resource management areas, environmental areas focus more on natural resources, but there are battlefields and various other aspects of DNR lands that have varying amounts of ecological protection, or at least designation of ecological management goals. So, given the stream condition and the protected lands information that we have, categorized as I described, using the IBI of 3 being a healthy stream, the protected lands of different types having various amounts of protection, we ran 2 analyses in each case. We looked at a logistic regression mix model, again where we're focused on the yes or no, is it healthy or not healthy, again a probability of the IBI being greater than or equal to 3, and then the generalized linear model when we're using actually the mean of the IBI. So again, the score can vary from 1 to 5, and we're looking at how that mean varies across our analyses. And we looked at the slope of change over time and how it varied geographically across the state by watershed. The Maryland 8-digit watershed, there's about 100 in the state of Maryland. And this is just for those statistical geeks we might have out there. And again, since Carlos is not on the call, I can't answer specific questions, but just to show you that we have laid out the methods in detail of how we're addressing each factor using the logistic regression and then also the generalized linear model for our analysis. Next thing you want to do once you've decided what your methods is what kind of data you have falling into the categories you're going to use and what kind of sample size. If you only have a few sites, you won't have the powerful analysis you'll want to have. And so here we are showing that FIBI, which is the Fish Index of Biotic Integrity, and BIBI, the one for benthic and macroinvertebrates, and the various levels and factors that we're considering. So we're considering protected and unprotected at the top of this table, but we're also looking at all the various other factors that affect stream condition across the state, which is where the regions are, like coastal, Piedmont, and Highland. There's cold water areas, there's agriculture areas, various different land uses were considered. So those were built into the model so that we could address any potential confounding factors. And then we broke it down to the actual classes that we're going to test in the model. You can see what kind of numbers we had. And this brings out a key feature that when we describe a land as protected or not protected, we're talking about the area of land, the upstream watershed, the catchment that drains specifically to that site. Each site, or each stream site is 75 meters that's sampled, which is representative of our reach. So we want to talk about the influences on that site from the upstream catchment. So while we have more than 1,000 stream sites to choose from here, those that are fully protected means that all the land in that catchment is in a protected class. It's a smaller number, and that's really what we're going to focus on. We don't want to analyze watersheds where part of it is protected and part of it is not, because that can be, obviously confounding. But if you look at these numbers, you can see that as we go down between our different categories, we want to compare all protected lands, DNR protected lands, larger protected lands greater than 100 acres, and DNR lands greater than 100 acres, and we still have pretty decent numbers, all down, the 50s and so forth. And so we have enough to work from. And so that was the good news. So we proceeded with the methods as described. And now we want to show you again, if those numbers are okay, how is the distribution across the state? And again, you're looking at a bunch of different dots here, and these numbers correspond to the table I just showed you, say about 50 sites, and they're colored as to what ecological region they're in. But again, the point here is really just to say that there are dots, there are stream sample results across the entire state. So you see them in eastern Maryland, southern Maryland, northern, western, all across the state. And for unprotected, a lot more, obviously. There's a lot more sites that are sampled in watersheds that are unprotected. But again, a good distribution across the entire state. So that's, again, good news for us from a statistical point of view. So hypotheses, now that we have a plan, what do we want to ask very specifically? And we're asking, are protected areas always healthy? Is stream condition better with different types of protection? And again, we're looking specifically at the size of the protected area, the management regime, the length of time it's been protected. We'd like to know that. We don't always know that last one, unfortunately. And the third thing is more protected land in a watershed. From a different analytical point of view, more protected land, greater proportion of the watershed protected. Does that work? And we would, especially we're concerned if they're well-managed lands. So here's the results. So we're just going to run through a number of sides. They'll look like this. They'll either have a fish, a nice brown trout up in the corner, or they'll have a mayfly, benthic macroinvertebrate in the corner, so you'll know which of the indices we're looking at. Again, we're looking at the IBIs, which when they're greater than 3 is a healthy stream, and the number from 1 to 5 shows increasing health. And each time we're going to show 2 different analyses. We're going to show the analysis with the logistic binomial. For the second one, the first one here, we've got the index. So this is the actual number. You can see from 1 to 5 would be your max. So how does an IBI for fish change over the 20 years that we are looking at it? And how does it show in 2 different classes, protected and unprotected? So that's what we're looking at, is the initial distinction between protected and unprotected. And the hypothesis was that they'd be better in protected areas. But when we look at this, we see that's not the case. We see a very flat line for unprotected lands, around between 2.5 and 2.8, which is just below a healthy level for those 20 years for unprotected lands. But in protected lands, it seems to go up a little over time, but pretty much crosses it over, so there's really no difference between the two. So, okay, that was a little surprising, but we delve into the results and now look at the same analysis. Again, I wanted to emphasize that we're looking at it 2 ways. That was just the actual IBI score itself, and now the probability that the IBI is healthy, greater than 3. So by looking at both of those kinds of analysis, we have more confidence that we're seeing a real result. In this case, again, the protected lands are a little below the unprotected lands, so not what we expected for fish, but there may be a reason for that. So now we're going to go over to our, actually a stonefly. Those of you that know your insect larva will know it's a stonefly. So here again, the scores for the insects are a little bit higher, but again, while the protected lands maybe look better than they did for fish, they're really not significantly different from unprotected. This is looking at the index itself, and then the next one is the probability of healthy or not healthy, and you can again see that they cross back and forth. This is more variable, but again, no difference between the two. So why might that be? So we begin to look now at the factors that could affect that initial hypothesis of protected versus unprotected land. So we're looking at land use, and I mentioned before that we had good coverage of our stream sampling all across the state. You can see the ecoregions, coastal plain, Piedmont, highlands, across the state, and you can see the amount that is in different land uses. And as you would suspect, those of you familiar with the area, the Baltimore to Washington corridors, where most of the impervious cover and densely developed areas are throughout the state. Fair amount of agriculture on the eastern shore in central Maryland as well, more forested areas toward the west. So those are included in the analysis. So here's a bar graph showing you the, again, estimate of the IBI score, and we're looking around 3. So the ones that are above 3 are the ones you would expect, the ones that have, forests, water, wetlands, natural habitat, land uses, and then the ones that are the worst are the ones that are commercial, other development, as you would expect as well. So again, land use is a factor. It's nothing new, but it does show in our data and helps explain some of our results. So now let's break down the different kinds of protected lands that we have. So here's DNR protected lands. Again, I want to show these maps to, again, show coverage, and again, it's across the entire state, which is good so that we're not confounding geography very much. These are DNR-owned properties and conservation easements. And so here are the results now looking at DNR lands only. So we're stepping down from all protected and unprotected to just DNR as the protected class, DNR lands. In this case, you see, remember the first one where the protected class was below? Now it's maybe a little higher, but still pretty much indistinguishable. It appears to be indistinguishable from the unprotected, but if you look at the actual model results, you can see that it is significantly different. So in actuality, when the protected lands are only DNR lands, which again is the ones that we presume are more managed for natural resources, you do have a significant effect of protection class. You see that in your second row to the right, 0.03. The year make a difference as well, because things are changing over time, which is an interesting result. But and land use is also a very strong effect. You can see that as we suspected. But the strata, the different ecoregions, is not an important effect. We do also have an interaction effect between year and protection class. So now we're looking at the benthic macroinvertebrates. Same two graphs, looking first at the index. And we see in this case, protected lands, DNR lands, are in better condition than unprotected lands. And if we go to the next analysis, or go to the actual model results, we see that it's a strong effect for year, also even more strong than for fish in protection, and similarly land use and the interaction are also significant. So those are all consistent, showing that DNR lands do have better stream condition than unprotected lands. So the next thing we want to compare are larger sites. So we chose protected lands with over 100 acres of protection. Again, I mentioned before that there are a lot of different kinds of protected lands, but this just shows you that they occur, even the ones that are over 100 acres across the entire state. So we're not limiting ourselves to any particular area. Same analysis again, starting in this case, we're just going to show the insects, and you can see that we're looking at the index itself. So while unprotected lands are again barely and below the threshold of 3, all the protected lands that are large, greater than 100 acres, have a higher IBI in the 3.5 to 4 range. Now we're going to take the next version of this. We're going to look at the large DNR sites. So now we've cut it down so we have the DNR sites that we think are managed mostly for natural resources. We take the larger sites, which also makes sense that they have less influence from adjacent land uses. And again, there are fewer of these as we step down in class. We narrow it, but we still have distribution across the entire state. And here we're again looking at the benthic macroinvertebrates. And in this case, I think, the difference is now widening again as we get to what we think are likely to be more protected lands in the sense of protecting for natural resources and having a large area protected. Again, we're getting higher scores now, above 4 for protected lands that are large and DNR managed as opposed to unprotected sites. So that's basically the analysis that we expected. After we initially had the sort of surprising result, we realized that not all protected lands are the same, so we looked at different kinds, and we saw the result we expected, which is protected lands that are well managed and of good size are significantly larger than or significantly better stream condition than non-protected lands. But we want to do one more analysis, which is to look at these 8-digit watersheds. Again, these are about 90 square miles in size, just about 100, a little more than 100 in the state of Maryland. You can see them shown on this map. And the question here was, as you can sort of see, the protected lands there in yellow are crossing throughout, and there's a different number or different proportion of the land area in each watershed that is protected, with the remaining being non-protected. So this analysis, we ran simple regression here to see what the fish IBI, so again, we're starting below 3 when you have low percentage of a watershed protected, but it increases as you go to, and this is the mean values obviously, I'm not showing the variance, just the mean values, going out to 100%, you can see it goes up and basically, interestingly, starts below the 3 and ends up beyond the 3 as you get more and more protected land in the watershed. That was for the fish. Here's the probability that the streams are going to be healthy, and again, we're starting out at a 50-50 coin flip and working our way up, to 2/3 of a chance of it being healthy when you have most of the watershed protected. So we'll do the same for the benthic macroinvertebrates. You can see here, again, starting around 3 and getting better with more of the watershed protected. And then if you compare with the probability, again, starting at 50% and going up again to around 2 out of 3 chance of being healthy. So this is sort of illustrates what I was just talking about. These are the Maryland 8-digit watersheds and protected lands here. And so basically, just to back up one slide again, so what we're doing here is we're just doing the same analysis that I just did for all protected lands, and the result that they showed, that increasing trend with more land protected. Now we're going to do it just for DNR lands, which again, as we know, are probably better for stream condition. If you do that, you see you have fewer data, but they're still spread around the state. And you now look at these graphs. So there's less data. They don't go all the way out because not many watersheds have 100% DNR land. But again, you see the same thing, starting around 3, which is the threshold of healthy conditions on. It keeps going up, close to 4, with about 70% protected. This is for fish. You look at the probability again, starting this time above, since it's DNR lands, they're above the coin flip of 50%, and they move on up close to 80% chance that they'll be healthy when there's 70% of the watershed, including DNR protected lands. And following through with the same steps of analysis using the benthic macroinvertebrates, starting at 3 and working our way up to 4 for DNR protected land, percentage of DNR protected lands in a watershed, and then using the probability, you can see again, starts near the coin flip and gets pretty high, that is 70%, which is the most that we saw in any watershed, 70% of it being DNR lands, about 90% likelihood that it will be healthy. So that's pretty close to my 30 minutes, and I'm just going to draw these simple conclusions here, and then I'll be curious to hear any questions folks might have. We went in with a hypothesis thinking that, protected lands will be better. Pretty simple, right, guys? Let's get some data, which, we were lucky to have, and see how it turns out, and that was not the case. all protected lands are not created equal. And we realized that when we began to dig in and see what kinds of protected lands we have. We recognized that there were different management types. Even amongst DNR lands, some are managed for historical reasons rather than natural resources, but in essence, they're still protected. Size was important. As I mentioned before, the Forest Conservation Act areas, which is a nice part of Maryland regulations, but again, sometimes creates relatively small slivers of protected land as they're left forested, but they're so separated and isolated from other lands that they don't have a lot of value and they don't provide the streams with as much protection. And time protected seems to matter. I mean, one of the things that you could see in those graphs was that, especially for protected lands, it seemed that the condition of streams improved over time. There's some complications of what watersheds and stream types were selected over time, so it's just suggestive at this point, not necessarily significant. So we go from that initial hypothesis being refined to concluding that truly protected streams and watersheds are in better condition. And the fact that we ran the analysis, two different ways with the IBIs and then ran it in full watersheds rather than based on sites, did it both with sites and full watersheds, it all came up with the same answer. Makes me pretty confident that we can say that preserving healthy watersheds and green infrastructure networks, which again are these connected lands in natural condition, will provide the ecosystem benefits over time and is something we should continue to do. So with that, I'm ready to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Anyone have any questions for Mark? I'm kind of curious, Mark, when you looked at the data, sure, were you surprised at your ability? I mean, Maryland's a pretty small state. Were you surprised at your ability to find watersheds that were pretty much all protected or significantly protected to be able to do the analysis itself?
Yeah, so it's important, and maybe I wasn't as clear as I could have been, but again, what we try to do is analyze things multiple ways so we feel like consistent results give us more confidence in the answers. And when I mentioned that the stream sites are 75-meter segments, so you go into it, you put it down randomly, you feel like you have a representative stream condition for the larger area you're looking at. If you throw them in randomly within a watershed of varying size, you can make those area-wide estimates. But what was important for understanding the things that are affecting that stream, like whether it's protected or not, is that upstream catchment be protected. And you make a good point that if it's a large stream, it's going to be a pretty big catchment draining to that point. But in a lot of cases, they're relatively small. So the fact that we had so many stream sites and going down into including first-order streams on a 1 to 100,000 scale map meant that we had enough places where that entire 10-acre or 100-acre or whatever area draining to that site could be protected. So that's the reason that works. So that wouldn't be the case if we were looking at really large streams, and that's why we did the second analysis where we had those bigger watersheds, the ones that are 90 square miles, and said, okay, this is not all protected or unprotected, but let's look at the percentage of protection in there and how that affects the area-wide estimate, which is again possible because we have random selection of sites within those larger watersheds.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you. And given the the robustness of the data set and so forth, I guess one of the things I am also curious about for other listeners may be interested as well, if they wanted to do something like this in their own state, would you need a similarly robust data set to do it, or are there other suggestions that you might have if somebody wanted to pull something together and do a similar analysis for their own state?
Yeah, I'd love to hear, results from other parts of the country. There are definitely lots of good monitoring programs out there. There may not be many that, have as much data for small spaces that we have, but for the spaces that they do have a good monitoring, and maybe it's just a very large watershed in a particular state or something like that, you can do both of the kinds of analysis that I mentioned. If your sites are not randomly selected or not probability-based selected, you can do the site-based analysis and just compare all of the sites that you have with the watersheds or the catchments that drain to them. But if you do have a random or probability-based assessment for whatever area, then you can do the percentage of protected lands in that watershed because your sample sites are representative of that whole watershed. And that's the important distinction to make if you're trying to do area-wide estimates of condition. So I'd be interested, even on small scales, to see what kind of results people might have.
Great, great. And so anyone listening or listens to the webinar subsequently could contact you if they have ideas about something they might want to do in their own state. They could give you a call or get in touch with you, and you could talk a little bit about possible methodology.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk to folks. And you have a grant cycle open, right? So maybe we could talk together and figure out a way to do something. If the data's there and they want to pursue it, I'd be happy to help them advise or partner with them as most effective. Happy to do that. I see I've got a couple of questions from Chris Olson, and she asked first, what are some of the management activities that impacted stream quality? And of course, the one that I showed, sort of the obvious one, but it was nice to see it play out with land use. More developed land uses, more intensive land uses, had lower IBIs than the more protected ones, forests and wetlands in particular. So there's the NBSS data set. Anyone who's interested, again, it's more than 20 years now, and there are annual reports. There are a lot of stressor-related reports where we flag stream conditions of having stressors at certain levels, conductivity or acid neutralizing capacity or nutrients or any of these kind of things, and also habitat, riparian areas. So all those things are sampled as part of this program, so you can go in and see what the relationships between stream condition and all those factors are. And there's overall effects, obviously, but there are also some more geographic effects related to ecological conditions. So I'd be happy to point you in the direction. But if you just search Maryland Biological Stream Survey, you'll find the Stream Health website and a lot of reports there that describe those things. So we didn't really dig in here into those details in this analysis. Her second question, which is a good one, if the entire watershed is protected for your protected watersheds, why would size of the protected area have an impact? Isn't the whole watershed protected? And so you can think of that two ways, one of which is there are some impacts that aren't strictly based on the watershed. You can bring things into the watershed atmospherically, or people driving in, or activities coming in beyond the ridgeline, and things that happen in the watershed even if it's protected. And the other one has to do, again, with what kind of protection is really going on. Because when we protect it, we haven't put a bubble around it. What we've done is designated it for protection with certain management regime associated with that. And so if that means that but I would think larger areas have less of an edge effect of things that come in on the sides of it, and larger areas are generally probably more often protected for natural resources because the reason that they're large is that it's the natural resources that they're focused on, rather than being a small area that perhaps is focused on something not quite as natural resource focused, like historic sites, et cetera. And the last question from Karen Gabriella is that the project report available online. Is that the case, Jeff? I'll ask you.
That's a good question. It is not currently. We will probably have to think about the best way to do that. We haven't made final project reports available, partly because some of them include other information about financing and so forth and so on. So let me think about that, and we'll try to make sure that something gets out and is posted online within the next month or so.
Okay, and if Karen wants to contact me individually, that's fine. If it's okay with you, since mine doesn't include that kind of information, I'm happy to send it to them. But that wouldn't be posting it for everyone, but it's up to you, Jeff.
Yep. Okay. Any other thoughts, questions that people have for Mark?
Looks like we got another question from Jen Nix. How did this project rank fit with your, this is probably for you, Jeff, with other Healthy Watershed Consortium projects during its grant cycle? I'd love that it's analytical, just wondering if it is unique compared to other submitted funded projects.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a little bit unique. We don't typically fund or haven't funded projects that are more exclusively research focused like this, but we felt like this was potentially a project that could help. I think we characterize this as one of our advancing the state of practice grants, and so we were curious about whether or not this type of analysis could actually lead to some answers to some important questions about protected versus unprotected watersheds, and therefore some of that might be transferable to other places. It was a small one-year grant. Many of our other grants are multi-year grants, so it wasn't one of the larger grants that we funded. But I would say that it was competitive, and I think Mark did a good job. I mean, his team did a good job with this. Most of our grants are in the category of building watershed protection capacity, which is another one of our categories, and most of them are focused on acquiring additional lands in terms of watershed protection, where the goals are X number of acres will be protected over so many years, et cetera. So this was a little bit unique among our grants.
And so, Jeff, this is Mark again. I would say that, I appreciate being included, and I learned a lot from the workshop we had from the other folks, which, as you described, have different kinds of projects. But so hopefully this provided, again, some justification, evidence-based support for, continuing healthy watershed projects across the country. And I would say that, the additional stuff that could be brought to bear as additional evidence would be looking at the years that these areas were protected. So we saw how the condition changed over time, but we don't know whether, and this is because the data wasn't available, whether that particular protected area and the watershed draining to that site was protected the year before or 50 years before. And that might play a big part. And again, we were only able to drill down to a certain level as to what the management regime of each thing is. And those are both things that can be done, but sort of require, more data compilation and digging into not already compiled data sets to get that kind of information. That could, probably make our line sharper and our gaps bigger,
Right. And it's a good potential suggestion to others working around the country. Many of you are involved in watershed protection initiatives that have been going on for a while, and or you'd like them to go on for a long period of time. And so as you're thinking about that, once you protect a piece of land, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the right condition in terms of watershed integrity. You have to maintain it in that condition, and there may be improvement based on management over time. So that might be something worth thinking about tracking as you consider a long-term vision for your watershed and what needs to happen in it. All right. Well, thanks again, Mark. Unless there's any additional questions, I guess we will probably just wrap up the webinar at this point. For any of you who have other colleagues who did not get a chance to listen in this afternoon or this morning if you're out on the West Coast, we will post the webinar. The recording of the webinar will be posted in just about a day or so you can refer people to the U.S. Endowment's website, as Camille indicated, and you'll be able to get a recording that you can listen to at your leisure. All right.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for joining in.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good afternoon. Take care.
Bye-bye.